Marc Levin here, Director for the Center for Effective Justice, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and also Policy Director for our Right on Crime initiative. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today to our panel on adult corrections in Texas. And we have a tremendous selection of speakers. And then, of course, we'll have time for Q&A, as always. And just to kind of put this issue in context, we've had, I think, a tremendous run of success in Texas on adult corrections reform. As many of you know, crime rate in Texas is down by more than 22% over the last several years. At the same time, our incarceration rate has dropped 12%. And we're seeing many innovations across the counties in Texas. And really, I think, a growing support. In fact, I would say even perhaps a consensus that we must take the next steps. We must continue to also make sure that we defend the gains that have been achieved by prioritizing some of those proven alternatives to incarceration, from drug courts to other types of treatment programs and specialty courts. And so I think this next legislative session holds tremendous promise for us to continue the great progress that we've seen. So I think the expertise we gained from the speakers today will very much help us in doing that. I want to first introduce Adam Gelb, who will lead off today's panel. He's director of the Pew Public Safety Performance Project, where he has advanced policies and practices across the country that have reduced recidivism and held offenders accountable while also controlling corrections costs. He's been involved in crime control and crime prevention for many years. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia and also a public affairs degree from the Harvard School of Government. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gelb.
Thank you. Super. Thanks, Mark. It is a real pleasure to be back here again, so thank you, and particularly with this panel. Apologies to those who, how many people were in this panel last year? We're not going to cover any of the same information. This is all brand new, updated. No, my job is to quickly set the stage for what's going on around the country before turning it over to the folks here who've got a different perspective on things. So I'm going to run through this. I'm going to run through this real quick, particularly because it's actually not that different from last year's presentation. Is this going to zap for me, Mark?
It should be. It just have to be pointed at the.
Where's the? Here, why don't I lean down here?
Turn which on? Oh, this thing. Yep. Okay. This was off. Now it's
Magic
was
off. Okay.
All right. We're saving
All
batteries
right.
here.
So quickly setting the stage here.
Larry, you gonna stay and hear me?
After a long. After a long period of time, which criminologists refer to a period of stable punishment or stability of punishment, as you can see in a sort of 50-year period here where the incarceration rate was basically the same, we had an explosion in starting in the 70s and through the 80s and 90s and really into this century, to the point where in 2008 we got to 1 in every 100 adults in this country behind bars. So you have the prison and the jail population, and you get about 2.3 million people behind bars. There's about 230 million adults, 1 in 100 people behind bars. We're going to talk in a second about how that's fallen back here, but you see now the current number that's just been put out for the year-end 2012 shows that 1 in 100 has fallen back, so 9-10% to 1 in 110, and that's obviously in good part due to the efforts here in Texas and in other places, right? Even if the prison population has not dropped significantly, the resident population continues to grow, so the incarceration rate drops. So that's what's sort of seen in Texas and nationally. The prison population itself has sort of flattened out, but the general population continues to rise, so the incarceration rate is slowly dropping. When you look at probation and parole, the same kind of trend here. That peaked also in 2008 at 1 in 31 adults under some form of correctional control. Right? So think about that, 3% of the adult population in this country in prison, on probation, in prison or jail, on probation or parole. That has fallen back. The most recent numbers out from BJS from the end of 2013 showing now that's back to 1 in 35. Still an incredibly high rate, but moving at this point in what I think many folks would think would be the right, but particularly folks interested in limited government and fiscal discipline in the right direction. Similar kind of trend here with dollars, not quite the same though. This is sort of one of these government, sort of how government works, right? It's you can have the population bend down, but the money doesn't really necessarily follow that. We're seeing sort of flattening out of the money even as the population dips a little bit, but you can see the general rise in spending to a point where we're now at about 1 in 14 general fund dollars of state budgets spent on the correction system. So in that context, this huge rise of the prison population, the jail population, and overall, we've seen a tremendous wave of reform around the country. So here's the map, Bill, that we were talking about before. If you can, why that's not big on this screen over here, so you guys can see a little better. But this is a map of states that have participated in what's called the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. So that doesn't mean that we've got every state here covered that's done some kind of reform, but as part of Justice Reinvestment, which is an intensive technical assistance model that we at Pew and the Justice Department, the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and others participate in to provide intensive technical assistance to states to help them analyze their prison populations, figure out what is driving them up, and then what might be done to bend that curve consistent with public safety. And so you see the representation here of how many states have been through this. Is well more than half the states at this point. About 31 states have been through the process. Some have made some pretty substantial gains. Those are the ones that we have in blue. And when I say gains, I mean past reforms that are fairly significant in terms of sentencing and release policy, as well as reentry and other efforts designed to reduce recidivism. The ones in yellow, more limited reforms. And then as you can see here, there are 4 states that are actively working this right now, going into their 2015 sessions, and that's Alabama, Nebraska, Utah, and Washington. Take a close look at this, because at the end of the session there will be a quiz on this chart. There's just a little bit of detail behind each of those states, and if I could just ask you to notice that the chart moves from right to left for reasons I'm not entirely clear why we do it that way, but you can just sort of see there are more check marks, which means more policies that the states, as time has progressed in the first few years. The reform's not that broad, not that many check boxes, but as we move forward in time, a lot more extensive reforms and a lot more checks sort of toward the higher end of that scale there, which is really states changing sentencing laws and policies. Why is this happening? To me, this is the most important question, right? There's an assumption out there that the reason this has all been happening is because of the money, and that states, unlike the federal government, have to make ends meet. They have to balance their budgets. And so when the recession hit, states started to sort of frankly hold their noses and make a bunch of changes that they didn't like, that they actually thought might hurt public safety, but they kind of had to do them because they had to balance their budgets. And I just want to say, from our vantage point at Pew and working with states, there's no question that dollars are part of the equation here, right? You kind of have to be really naive to not think that the budgets play a role in here. But what we've seen is that they get people to the table, but they don't result in votes. In many cases in these states, unanimous votes in both chambers to change sentencing laws and release policies that people don't want to do just because they want to save a couple $100 million. We don't see that happening. We see these 3 reasons why, and I just want to offer here that in Texas, in 2005 first, and then 2007, as you all will know, the budget here was looking pretty good in those years. when those reforms were made, particularly in 2007, the economy humming along. In fact, I don't believe, even though the recession nationally hit in summer, fall, it was really the fall of 2008, in Texas, because of your economy here, it was still humming along well into 2009. I don't believe the recession hit here till later. So I think Texas is exhibit A of a lot of things in this area, but one of them is that money is not the driving force behind what's going on here. So what is, in our view, as we've worked around the states, is that particularly now that Texas has had this track record of success that Marc discussed, that states are seeing that it's possible to put the brakes on prison growth and reduce crime at the same time. They're seeing a very supportive political environment, particularly with a lot of leading conservatives around the country, which TPPF and Right on Crime has helped organize and amplify those voices of folks like Newt Gingrich, who will be here tomorrow, and Grover Norquist, who is somewhere around here today. I don't know if he's still in the building. But also in polls and otherwise, very supportive public environment for change. Excuse me. And then finally, and we really think this is most important, although Senator Whitmire can say different, but policymakers are really starting to recognize and see the research about approaches that are more effective and less expensive than prison, right? This is not something that we had 30, 40 years ago. We didn't really know what worked. Now we do. There's nothing foolproof that works, but there's pretty good research that indicates what does. And policymakers are more and more aware that there are effective but far less expensive approaches for lower risk nonviolent offenders. So these are the things that we see really driving what's going on around the country. I want to very quickly go through just two examples, one policy in one state here, of some of the kind of reforms we're seeing. How many folks in the room are familiar with Proposition 47 out in California? Right, so this was a ballot measure that was run there to change sentencing and for property and drug crimes. I thought it was absolutely fine. There were maybe some problems with it, a lot of people did, but it was a big to-do. It was a big ballot measure, and the impact from the millions and millions of dollars that were spent on advocacy around this was what's estimated to be about 5,000 or 6,000 beds savings a year. And I just want to point out a different way that California went about reform in 2009, which is very similar, again, to what Texas had done with respect to incentivizing decisions to revoke people from probation. So California in 2009 adopted what we call a performance incentive funding program. They ceded $45 million to the California counties for probation. That was invested in evidence-based programs and helped the county probation departments reduce probation failures by 23%. That in turn has led, over the 4 years that program has been in place, to a reduction in prison admissions of over 27,000 offenders. Savings to the state of coming up on, it's probably by today, because this is the end of last fiscal year, of $920 million. And the counties have been reimbursed, as the 2009 law said, half of that money to plow back into supervision. So this has been a big win-win in California. There was no ballot initiative. There were no tens of millions of dollars spent on getting this through. Big bipartisan vote, big change in California. Mississippi, I won't go through all this, but you can see from here the extensive reforms that Mississippi made just this past legislative session, the impact that has, the projected impact that has on that population. They're in mid-22s. They expect to go down a good bit rather than increasing substantially over the next 10 years, saving in Mississippi a quarter billion dollars that they would have spent otherwise. That last message, which is really sort of the first here that I want to leave you with, is this notion I think that Texas is really demonstrating so soundly, and that is that it is not a zero-sum game between crime and imprisonment. This assumption that if you want crime to keep going down, prisons have to keep going up, is just not being borne out in the last several years. In fact, the states where imprisonment is dropping, the crime rate is dropping faster than in the states where the imprisonment rate is still rising. And just sort of comparing here Texas with Nebraska, you see Texas, and this is the last 5 years from 2008 to 2013. You see the imprisonment rate and the crime rate dropping double digits here in Texas, whereas in Nebraska, the imprisonment rate continues to climb, but the crime decline has been even less here than in Texas. So congratulations again to Senator Whitmire. Representative Madden works now with TPPF as a senior fellow on the Right on Crime for the work that they did and the example that Texas continues to provide across the country and the other leaders here as well, of course. The Texas story is obviously saving tremendous amount of money and improving public safety here in the state, but is driving a tremendous amount of the conversation around the country. So you all ought to be really proud of what you've accomplished, and thank you, and hope you keep it up this session.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Adam. Our next speaker is Bill Montgomery, who is the elected Maricopa County Attorney, which in Texas is District Attorney. So he's responsible for prosecuting crimes in the Phoenix, the county containing Phoenix, which has about 4 million people. And unfortunately, some of them are smugglers. But he has had tremendous success in prosecuting crime and securing victims' rights and protecting the community. He graduated from West Point and is a decorated Gulf War veteran. He has been very successful in, I think, focusing the use of incarceration on serious, violent, and career criminals. At the same time, really a model effort to divert those low-level, nonviolent drug offenders from prison and even from prosecution in many cases into successful treatment programs. And I think that's something we've been working on in Texas in terms of drug sentencing reform, similar to what they currently have in Arizona, and that he has had tremendous success with. So we are really thrilled to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Bill Montgomery.
I want to thank Marc and the staff here for giving me the chance to come to Texas, where it's half the temperature of what it is in Phoenix. But I get to come and hang out with you good folks instead of hanging out with the president who's in Phoenix today, and I'm okay with that. I am a former naturalized Texan. Both of my tours in the Army were here in Texas, one at Fort Hood and the other one at Fort Bliss. And I'm the answer to off-the-wall trivia question. If you want to know who the person was that got to take the M1A1 tank down Congress for the Texas Heroes Parade after Desert Storm, I was that second lieutenant from Fort Hood.
That's great.
Did you mess up our street?
Just go
There we go. I tried to make it easy.
I'm sure you could give Adam's presentation, but we
I might have a few different takes. And I'm going to give a brief overview of my jurisdiction, some of the issues that we face there. If you're going to talk about incarceration rates and criminal justice policy, it's important to understand when you're looking at state by states what the factors are that go into the type of crime that you see committed there and what it is that those states are having to deal with in carrying out their responsibilities to ensure that their citizens are safe and their liberties are protected. And for us in Arizona, we have a bit of a unique environment, though some aspects of it we do share with Texas. As Marc mentioned, Maricopa County is the fourth most populous county in the nation at 4 million people. Phoenix, the state capital, is within my jurisdiction. It's the sixth largest city. It's where my main office is located. Maricopa County has 2/3 of the state's population. We have about 2/3 of the crime. Therefore, we are the largest contributor to our state's prison population. And our prison system is known as the Department of Corrections, or otherwise DOC. The county itself is the 15th largest county in the country. We're bigger than some East Coast states at 9,200 square miles. My office itself is the third largest county-based prosecution agency in the country with over 320 prosecutors. And then I also have civil responsibilities, so that's where the remainder of the attorneys come from. In last calendar year, we prosecuted over 31,000 felony cases, about another 26,000 misdemeanors. We do have responsibility in some limited jurisdiction courts within the county. And we are a destination county for human and drug smuggling from Mexico. The southern border for Arizona is made up of the Yuma and Tucson sectors. And for calendar year 2014, the Tucson sector was the site of roughly half of all drugs smuggled into the United States. We were number 2 for human smuggling. There have been years where we were also the location where half of all human beings were smuggled, but the Rio Grande sector is now outpacing us by a factor of about 3. That's not a race we want to win, but it's not a situation that's acceptable either. And within my county, we have command and control elements for the Sinaloa cartel because we are the distribution hub for the Sinaloa cartel's heroin distribution network throughout the United States. So that's what we get to deal with. And I want you to keep that in mind when I talk to you about how Arizona uses incarceration as a tool for public safety. Now, this chart right here shows from 1985 until 2013 our prison population growth based upon total population at the end of each year. Our commitment rates from a month to month and year to year may differ, but this is what the growth has been. For the most recent year in 2013 that's reflected on there, we were in excess of 40,000 people. The 2 arrows on there indicate 2 important dates that that'll be reflected in some of the comments I make. The one to the left indicates when truth in sentencing went into effect in Arizona. That was in 1994. That law requires inmates sentenced to the Department of Corrections who have not committed specific type of offenses that require flat time. They must serve 85% of that sentence. And then next to that on the right, in 1996, Arizona voters passed through initiative a change to our probation statutes that mandates substance abuse treatment for the first 2 drug possession or use offenses. Over this same time frame then reflected on that graph, the incarceration rate in Arizona has increased about 18 to 19%, while our population has increased over that same time frame about 54%. Within the last 10 to 15 years, Arizona has been in the top 3, at least, and some years dropped down maybe the top 5 for fastest growing states. And my county has been in the top 10 among the fastest growing counties in the nation, leading up to about 2007, and we're slowly inching our way back up now. At that same time, that top line that you see, the red line, that is our state's crime rate, made up of both violent crime and property crimes in the Part 1 crime report from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting System. The green line underneath that shows the same type of crimes nationally. So yes, we're above the national crime rate, and I've already told you why. But over that same time frame, going back to 2002 now, when you compare Arizona's crime rate to the U.S. crime rate, it has dropped precipitously. In some areas of Part 1 crimes, our crimes have dropped 2, 3, as much as 4 times faster nationally. Over that same time frame, you can see that our prison population has increased. And our DOC budget, the most recently submitted one, is requesting almost $1 billion. So you can say, wow, that's a whole lot of people in prison. Yeah, that's true. But remember, the first duty of government is to protect public safety. And every dollar spent by government on public safety is a constitutional dollar versus a feel-good program or something that somebody may want to take credit for in order to get reelected. This is something that government is supposed to do. The next couple of slides that I'm going to show you are statistics from a report done back in 2009, published beginning of 2010 by Dr. Darrell Fisher. Dr. Fisher used to be the statistician for the Department of Corrections. The Arizona Prosecuting Attorneys Advisory Council, made up of elected prosecutors within the state of Arizona, some municipal prosecutors, and our Attorney General, formed that council. And we wanted to know who's in prison. You know, we keep hearing there are too many people in prison. Well, who's there? If we have the most violent and those most responsible for committing felonies in prison, then we can say that's who should be in prison. And if you want to let people out, we want to be able to identify specifically which category of crime or which profile of offender do you want to release. And so in 2009, we had a study done. We did it again in 2011. We did it again in 2013. And the numbers are somewhat similarly reflective of what I'm going to show you this initial study. But this now allows us, from an objective, data-driven standpoint, to talk about our prison population and who are we spending those dollars on incarcerating. In that first graph right there, we'll show you that for violent offenses, the most serious current offense category easily outpaces all other commitments. The second one next to that, that's for sex offenses, and then property offenses, and next to that, drug trafficking. Why would that be so high? Because we're the main thoroughfare for the Mexican cartels to push their product up through the United States. And thanks to Colorado and their legalization efforts and the federal government's ineffective or indifferent attitude, those cartels are now trying to get to Colorado. Now, Over this same time frame, too, that I've been mentioning, from 2009 when we did this first study and to the next one, we did see a tremendous drop or flattening out of our prison population for the first time in the history of Arizona. And what we found in the course of those additional studies is that we were revoking fewer people to prison from probation, fewer low-level felons or nonviolent felons were going to prison. We were utilizing diversion and offering substance abuse treatment, but at the same time, as I'll show you, our violent and repeat felons started to increase. This next slide right here is the median time to be served in years by the most serious current offense category. I mention this because one of the things you need to keep in mind when you talk about the incarceration rate in the United States or in any given state is that for the most part it's a transitory population. These are people who are coming in for a few years and then going out. And in terms of the U.S. incarceration rate, that includes our jails. Other countries around the world don't have a jail type system. We also incarcerate our seriously mentally ill. That's a topic for another day. Other countries won't incarcerate, they'll put them in a hospital setting, but it's still a restriction on their liberty. They get to call it something different when they're reporting that information to the UN. Plus, I really don't think we can count on Cuba, Iran, China, or other totalitarian regimes to be honest about who they're incarcerating. Okay. More information that we were able to derive from the report that we commissioned. And by the way, some of the criticisms of that report, and I'll be honest with you, there are a few, has been that prosecutors got what prosecutors paid for. But prosecutors cannot create a criminal history where it does not exist. Prosecutors cannot say someone's in prison for 10 years for an offense they were not convicted of and were not sentenced for. Again, in the median total time to be served by most serious current offense, I picked the top 10. The top 10 people and their median total time to be served in prison in Arizona in 2009. That list includes first-degree murder, second-degree murder, a dangerous or deadly assault by a prisoner or juvenile, sexual conduct with a minor, continuous sexual abuse of a child, sexual assault, molestation of a child, manslaughter, sexual exploitation of a minor, and a prisoner who committed an assault with intent to incite a riot or participate in a riot. Who do you want to let out? Who do you want to have move in next door to you? Who do you think letting out would contribute to public safety? This is what this report has allowed us to focus on. And when we look at this now as prosecutors and share this information with our legislators and with folks in the public, we can say, these dollars and who we're incarcerating is who you want us to be incarcerating. Next, this shows for those who have been committed to prison, how many prior felonies they've committed. The top line where it says none, the only way to go to prison in Arizona without having a prior felony criminal history is you have to commit a certain series of offenses. A dangerous crime against a child, molestation of a child, sexual misconduct with a child, or certain dangerous offenses. Whew, this time went fast. Deadly weapon or dangerous instrument, or serious physical injury. And 56% of those in prison had 2 or more, 41%, 42% had 3 or more felonies. During that same time in the truth in sentencing, what we found was that the average sentence was about 0.3 years longer than what it had been before truth in sentencing. So we took a look at, all right, for all those offenders who had been sentenced in that 0.3-year extra time frame, what did we do deterrence-wise? We prevented over 7,500 felonies, and this breaks out each category. This will be available later. So we prevented those offenses by increasing those sentences. And over the entire time, for those who had been sentenced under truth in sentencing, we prevented 1 million crimes. Why is that important? You got to look at the other side of that ledger. Sure, there is a cost for incarceration, but there's also a savings. There's a savings in the figure of the amount of money that gets spent by the victim of crime who's out of work, has to go get health care, and otherwise has to take time off of work to show up in court. And if just one of those offenses, if those offenses averaged $500 each, and it was way more than that, it's $500 million. That's $500 million in those 15 years that we saved in costs to our fellow citizens. Next one here, truth in sentencing versus non-truth in sentencing states. In just about every category of measurement, truth in sentencing states have seen a greater reduction in crime from 1991 to 2010. But what are we doing, though, to limit? Well, this is a slide right here that'll show. Then those 3 different periods where we did the study, initially 94.2% were in prison for a violent or repeat felony. Now that nonviolent felony category, I'll tell you, that includes child molesters. So again, you've got to be careful about looking at that. But over these 3 studies, we've seen that in that time frame, our violent population of offender went up 4.3%, while the nonviolent first offender dropped nonviolent offenders dropped 5.25%. Now, what are we doing to limit those going to prison? The substance abuse issues and drug possession or use offenses, with that voter initiative, we are encouraging people to undergo substance abuse treatment. We offer them diversion. If you successfully complete diversion, you could avoid having a felony conviction, and you can avoid being sentenced for that. We also use a drug court, which has been very successful in limiting offenders going to prison. This right here is some numbers that indicate that for fiscal year 2014, total successful diversions versus total unsuccessful diversions, 86% of the people successfully completed that program. So that's over 2,100 individuals who won't go through my office to be prosecuted, won't go through the court system, won't wind up within DOC. And then that's the lifetime of the program, over 61,000 who've gone through the drug diversion program. Again, in the overwhelming majority of those over the lifetime, 75% successful, haven't had to then prosecute them. Real quickly, this is our sentencing structure. We use a determinate sentencing structure. This isn't for the good judges, because they would do this anyways. This is for judges who need help to do the right thing and to look at the category of offender and what they've done. And in each one of these different categories, we're looking at the type of offense that was committed, criminal history, and the circumstances, both mitigating and aggravating in each one. Judges are able to move up within those ranges based upon facts that they find as a fact finder. Those are dangerous crimes against children. And again, when you compare that to the fall in our crime rate, it is an effective tool for making that happen. Lastly, other programs we're looking for crime reduction, I'll wrap up. We're looking at reducing recidivism and focusing on that. Prisoner reentry programs, community partnerships for reentry programs, community corrections, adult probation programs using cognitive-based therapies and evidence-driven programs. We've seen over almost 77% successfully completed probation last year, less than 22% revoked, and of that, less than 7% committed a new felony. There's where I got my information. They'll have my contact information too if you want to email or talk to me later about additional information here. That went way too fast. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. And I mean, I really think that as we look at it, it is you have to keep a lot of things in mind as you compare different states. But I think as you look at the numbers in Arizona, I think because of some of the things they have, like the ballot measure dealing with drug diversion and the programs you talked about, I think that they have a higher percentage of those going to prison are violent and career criminals, whereas in Texas, there's not the same structure in our sentencing laws, and so there's a lot more discretion. You get a lot of variation across different parts of the state, and we have 17,000 people in Texas in prison for drug possession. And one of the other things, and hopefully we can explore this a little more in the QA, is because of this study, they have a better sense of the background of the people that are in prison. In Texas, we have a separation of the court data and the TDCJ data. We can't tell how many of those people are first-time offenders. We can only tell if they have a previous incarceration from TDCJ. So I think the data you have is very valuable for policymakers to make smart decisions. So let me now turn over to our two tremendous elected officials that are here with us today. And perhaps I would say no one in the Texas legislature knows more or has done more when it comes to criminal justice reform than John Whitmire, who represents the 15th Senatorial District in Houston, chairs the Senate Criminal Justice Committee. Y'all know him very well, and we are very pleased to have him today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Bill Montgomery, for being here. It was very informative. I do think, though, we have to keep in mind from the outset, you have 40,000 incarcerated, and there are similarities, but we have 150,000 incarcerated, so you immediately can start seeing some of the differentiation and maybe some of the challenging issues. And certainly you being on the border as we are, we share some common issues there. I miss Jerry Madden, but I'm sure thankful that I've got Representative Parker as a partner who has rolled up his sleeves and been very much an equal with me as he represents us in the House. Obviously, the Pew and Adam do their fine work. Not much time, so I'll hit some bullet points. First of all, if you don't remember anything else I say but this, remember that the criminal justice system is a system. And where we may focus on incarceration a lot, I would suggest to you we need to also look at the policeman and woman on the street, the prosecutors, the probation department, obviously corrections, but the parole. the reentry program, any one of them malfunctions and we got a problem. And one of my challenges is, through the years, is to get the different sectors to recognize that they are, Shannon, a part of the system. So we can have an outstanding model, but if we got a judge in Harris County that has conditions of probation, such as if they're 15 minutes late to meet with their probation officer, in writing it says you will revoke that individual, even though it's a DWI offender, depending on public transit. And so they give them expectations or requirements that most of us cannot meet. So I use that to illustrate that we're all in this together. It is a system. And let me quickly get to the adult system, which we're primarily speaking about today. First of all, there's a number of you in the audience that could stand up here and give us your perspective that I would enjoy hearing and we would all benefit from. But I was in 3 prisons yesterday. I was at a state jail, an intermediate sanctioned facility, and a halfway house. I would generally say, not just from yesterday, but from working on this on a daily basis, I would give our adult system passing grades. Certainly relative to where it was, certainly in 93, but 07, but even a year ago, 3 years ago. We shut 2 prisons last session. Mineral Wells State in the Dallas State Jail saved $98 million during the interim. We closed the central unit session before last, saved millions of dollars. No compromise with public safety. We didn't need the client space because of diversion alternative programs, and that system that I'm standing here emphasizing is a system. Now, passing grades, yes, although I still run into flaws. I was at the intermediate sanction facility. That's one of our reforms where if you violate parole, we used to send you back to prison, start over for failure to appear or having dirty urine. Now we send you downtown Houston to a 400-bed intermediate sanction facility for up to 9 months. I was there yesterday morning, and I got to visiting with the warden in front of Brad Livingston and all the brass. And I said, tell me how you get out of here after you've done your 9 months. Well, you do this, and you have a halfway house opportunity. I said, no, I really want to know how you get out. Which door do you go out of? Put a face on it. They said, well, if a halfway house is your next stop, they will pick you up. If not, if you're just being released on your own will, you go out the back door at 6:30 in the morning. In front of about 8 pretty important people that run the system, runs a contract vendor, I said, 6:30 in the morning. What if you don't have any money? And they all looked at each other. I said, streets of Houston, downtown, 6:30 in the morning, you're a parolee, you're labeled, you're profiled, probably may have a mental health issue. What if you have no money? They all looked at each other. And I became livid, like maybe a few of you have seen me. I said, you mean to tell me all of y'all in charge of this facility, this program, this state program, the director, and you're going to release a parolee on the streets of Houston at 6:30 in the morning completely broke, and you stand there and tell me that you care? At least give them a fighting chance. We're working on it right now. Over at the state jail, they actually have a reentry officer. She lines up housing, hopefully some food, maybe even job opportunities. We still got work to do. We got work to do at the adult level in mental health. We still have thousands of people incarcerated that their main problem was when they were mental health patients, they couldn't get services, they got off their drugs, they assaulted someone. Welcome to the criminal justice system. Another area. We're doing so much now with military courts. We're recognizing that the condition of serving in Afghanistan and Iraq leads to emotional problems that will get you in the criminal justice system. Do you each know, and we're going to talk about this session, I'm planting the seed today, we've got 10,000 of those people already incarcerated. So if we're doing diversion programs for military service, can we go upstream, back upstream, and see how many were incarcerated for the same condition now that we would work with you on? Prostitutions. We got 300 prostitutes in Gatesville this afternoon. 3 felony convictions for prostitution will get you up to 5 years in a prison. Guess what? I'm on the human trafficking interim study. The very ladies that are serving up to 5 years now, starting back 5 years ago, we're calling victims today. Help me, adults, legislators, stakeholders. Why can't we go back upstream and recognize that if we're calling them victims in our public hearings today and documenting that they're victims of human trafficking, Why are we incarcerating them, Shannon, and calling them criminals? We need to give them an opportunity to raise their hand and say, look at the circumstances and the facts of my cases, and I'm the same victim that y'all are trying to assist today. I'll move on to one other quick area where we can't be wasteful of our resources. Last year in Texas, we had 70,000 misdemeanor arrests for 2 or less ounces of marijuana. 70,000 people were taken to jail by our police. 23,000 of them ended up on misdemeanor probation. You know what I want my probation officers doing? Looking after people that we're concerned about. People that may have assaulted someone, someone that stole property. I'm not certain, in fact, I don't think the people of Texas want to spend their resources supervising 23,000 people, and their crime was 2 ounces of marijuana or less. We got to at least have a grown-up discussion about that. I could go on and on talking about some things in the adult system. My frustration is I was with the top brass yesterday, and at the end of the day we were visiting. I said, I noticed the other day my staff gave me a list of all 108 prisons. We're concerned about the low level of correction officers. Most of the prisons are being staffed at 60 to 70% of needed personnel. So I said, show me the prisons that are underserved by correction officers. I noticed how many prisons got 500 or 600 people. Now we got some with 3,000, Estelle, East Ham, and East Texas. But we got the Vance unit outside of Houston, 500 people. I said, Brian Collier, the assistant director, why don't y'all ever come and approach Tan or I with maybe merging a couple of them, saving some millions of dollars? Our administrators are still not proactive in Texas. Brad and Brian and their board never come to us. The prisons we closed, we kind of had to drag them along. They will give legislative testimony as to the need, but I need prison administrators that can give us ideas and suggestions. Now let me quickly move in my last minutes to the juvenile system. We're going to discuss it a lot this session. And before I get to the juvenile, depending who runs Criminal Justice Committee this coming session that we start in a week, and the committee assignments will be 2 weeks, whoever chairs it and runs it needs to have a show and tell, Marc, to demonstrate what the diversion and alternative programs have done for the state of Texas. We have not compromised public safety. I will say we take a back seat to no one on how tough we are, but certainly we have proven how smart we are. We need to have a show and tell and try to get the legislature to even spend more on drug and alcohol treatment, and for certain emphasize the mental health. So we'll do that in the first probably month of the session while the 9 freshmen are getting organized. The juvenile system is going to get a lot of focus. We have some great successes there. In 07, we had 5,000 people incarcerated at about 10 locations. We're down to 1,000 kids. Now you have to be a felon. Most of them have committed more than 1 felony. So we have a very hard juvenile population. That agency leads all state agencies in workman comp claims. A lot of the clients are pretty rough on the workers. On any given day at those 4 locations, I know you'll find this hard to imagine, Mr. Montgomery, but we get 70% of our employees show up at the 4 juvenile facilities, and you talk to them, they're scared. They're being assaulted. There are gangs at those locations. Most of the youth do not get the services they need. They don't get their mental health, drug, and alcohol treatment. They're not getting an education, and it is not uncommon for those facilities to be locked down for sheer safety of the workers and the students. They're at 4 rural locations that were great models when they were built in the 50s as a school. But now we have a very tough population, and I think we need to, for their own safety, confine them in smaller units, allow them to get the treatment and attention they deserve, and to protect them from each other. It's going to be hard. I understand the politics of closing the 3 adult units and also the previous closing of the juveniles. But ladies and gentlemen, we got to get away from playing politics with our clients. It's not about economics and building businesses and jobs in these communities. It's about public safety and sending back home a better youth than was sent to those facilities in the first place. With that said, I could go on and on, but I think I've hit the high points that I want to emphasize today. Remember what I said, it's a system. It actually starts, I guess you could say, and involves the legislature. And we have a great opportunity. I see the new folks that are being elected pretty much no-nonsense folks. They want to save dollars. They want efficiencies. I applaud that. But we're always going to have public safety. Adam, you were absolutely right. My good friend Tony Fabello, who works with Pew and Adam, they go around the country, and it was money, budget shortfalls that were driving the emphasis to either change the punishment, let people out early and whatnot. It was really never a financial consideration for us. We knew the cost savings, but it was really just smart. Number one, we couldn't run as many as we had built. We were short of correction officers. In '07, when the leadership wanted to build 3 more, I said in finance, I said, hell, we can't run the 108 we already have. We can't find correction officers. That's an issue we need to talk about sometime too. Maybe professionalizing our correction officers, paying them more, and also maybe raising the standards. We still have some contraband issues in our prisons. It's still not uncommon to find cell phones. Anyone want to tell me the #1 contraband, the hottest item in the prisons? Cigarettes. $5 for 1 cigarette. And unfortunately, we've documented some of our correction officers are making more money selling cigarettes as contraband than they do working for the state. We've come a long ways, but we got a long ways to go, and thank you. And if this organization, I used to be the only Democrat that got invited. I heard Kurt Watson was here today. And there's probably other Democrats in these halls. If I hear other Democrats showing up, I'm out of here. You know, y'all are getting way too moderate for me to spend my time over here.
Well, I do have to tell you, Senator Jose Rodriguez drove 8 hours from El Paso to be on our
that's
juvenile
it,
panel.
that's it.
And he was also here for the opening remarks by Steve Forbes. I will have to ask him if he agreed with everything that Mr. Forbes said. But any case, our next speaker is Representative Tad Parker, who serves as representative for House District 63 in the Metroplex. He's chairman of the Corrections Committee and did a terrific job last session. We spent some late nights together up there, not as late as criminal jurisprudence, though. And he oversaw the passage of more than 25 new statutes last session that improved our correctional system, although I think he'd be the first to tell you, as I will, that we should measure our success by how many bills we pass. Some of the best things we do are keeping bad things from going through. But he's graduated from the University of Dallas, as well as a master's degree from the London School of Economics. I think Mick Jagger was there. Well, he was there probably 20 years before you.
That's right, that's right.
But anyway, please join me in welcoming Chairman Parker.
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me. It's always a treat to be here at the conference, and I want to thank you for your leadership and all that TPPF does and the whole Right on Crime initiative. And obviously, it's a tremendous privilege to be here with my colleagues, with in particular Senator Whitmire. Thank you for your leadership and your mentoring of me last session as a first-term chairman of corrections. I learned so much from you, and it was obviously a tremendous privilege. So thank you very much, Senator, for all you've done on these issues for your entire career in the legislature. We appreciate you very much. You know, let me just kind of hit some of the highlights. Obviously, Senator Whitmire did a fantastic job of giving you an overview, and I'll really kind of yield my time probably for more Q&A here in a minute than anything. I think you all would find that to be most productive. But I will tell you just a couple of things. First and foremost, the interim charges that we had were pretty comprehensive. If you looked at the charges that we had administered to us by the Speaker in the House, that report will be out here the next couple of days. It's actually in the publishing arm, if you will, of House administration. And so the next couple of days you'll see broadly, if you will, the overview of what we touched on in our review, obviously, of TDCJ and so forth. Senator Whitmire, obviously, it's very difficult to follow him. He's kind of stole my thunder on some of these key comments. But what I will tell you is that I do think that the system is significantly improved, referring to the adult system, for it was just a couple of years ago. I do think we are making significant incremental, I think, promise, I should say, as well as progress on an annual basis. So I want to continue that. And I think that the administration is doing a good job. Not perfect, certainly lots of opportunity for improvement, always in anything, but I think we're on the right path with regard to what we're doing. You know, one of the major hearings that I had dealt with mental health. And one of the big discussions that we've had in the Senate and in the House has been the fact that, frankly, our jails have really become the repositories, if you will, of many of these patients that are dealing with mental health challenges. And so we need to be more intelligent with the way that we are handling them. And at the end of the day, when you look at the system, as Senator Whitmire says, from the beginning to the end, what you recognize is just how deficient we are in reentry. I think that's frankly our greatest area of deficiency. You know, in the last year or two, we've made improvement with some of these reentry coordinators. Just like Senator Whitmire mentioned, I've been there alongside them when they're making telephone calls and working to get someone in an apartment or get them a job. But we're not doing enough in those areas. I just really think we've got to be more aggressive. We've got to find ways to partner with the private sector when it comes to finding employment opportunities as well as it comes to housing. And it really also dovetails with the mental health piece that, you know, these folks that have been dependent on these psychotropic drugs, these various medications, you know, to not do more for them on the reentry process, we're not giving them a fair shake, in my mind, at an opportunity to stay out in the free world and not go back to a pattern of obviously repeating the crime and recidivism, obviously rates not going in the right direction. So it's very, very clear to me, and what I've done as Corrections Chairman in the House and what a privilege it's been here for this first session, that we've got to focus our time and energies more heavily on this entire reentry process. Now, with regard to right-on crime, let me make a couple of comments. And I fundamentally believe that, you know, what you're seeing here in the data is not by accident. It's been deliberate policy, obviously, that Senator Whitmire and my colleagues in the House have been pursuing over the course of a number of years to get us where we are here today. But I also believe that there's opportunity for further improvement in this area. I mean, the reality is that so many of these nonviolent drug offenses, in my opinion, we are kicking the can down the road. We are not solving a problem that really needs, in my mind, to be engaged with counseling and psychotherapy and so forth, as opposed to pure incarceration. We've got to be more intelligent, I think, in the way we look at some of these low-level, nonviolent crimes. And as Senator Whitmire said, you know, we will continue to be tough on crime, right? Jails exist for a reason, but it's for the violent populations out there that obviously could harm the 26 million people that live in this great state. So, you know, those are issues that I think you'll see us very much dabble in further when we convene this new session here next week. I also am looking at new innovative ways for us to be able to address some of the funding needs that we have for specific programs. One of those areas that we've spent a lot of time on here in my committee over the interim has been looking at social impact bonds. And I share that with you because I think social impact bonds are an attractive way potentially. They really require us looking further at ways in which we can actually specifically put in place various new programming to help address our recidivism rates, to address adult populations, to address youth populations and so forth, with very targeted concrete goals and milestones that can be obtained or not obtained. Today, if you look at the rate of success, many of our new programs, I think they're arguably questionable. And so if you look at some of these successful SIB programs that have been implemented elsewhere in the country and even around the world, for example, in the UK, and many of those, what you're seeing is very clear milestones being identified on a project up front. And so what I find to be attractive is that the state of Texas would not incur any cost for an SIB program unless it achieves the milestone, the hurdle that's being targeted. In other words, we're not going to pay for marginal results. We're not going to pay for things that don't work, for failure or poor performance. We'll only pay for exceptional performance that actually has the ability to exceed targeted goals and objectives with regard to reducing crime and various targeted circumstances. So in particular, I think we have opportunities with our juvenile population. As the Senator talked about, that's our area, I think, of greatest need, and I think we can actually move the needle in some significant ways in that regard. I'm also very proud of the fact that we did close 2 prisons last session. We saved, as the Senator said, roughly $100 million. That was an extraordinary accomplishment. And one of the things I think it's important for people to understand in Texas, these are not Republican or Democrat issues. These are common sense issues. These are Texas issues that affect all of us. And so I think you can continue to look that we will work in a very much a bipartisan manner to address these challenges, to continue to be tough on crime for those folks that need to be incarcerated, but always to be looking for more intelligent ways in which we can address crime within our society. So I want to appreciate you all being here. Thank you for your time, and I'll see the balance of my time for Q&A. I think that'll be most meaningful for the audience. Thanks for having me.
Well, we'd certainly like to entertain any questions. I have a question or two myself, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, first I'd like to say that actual guilt is not required for a conviction. All that's required is for the police and the prosecutor to convince someone that they need to plead guilty rather than take a chance of going to prison. An actual crime is not even required for a conviction. All it takes is a police officer and a prosecutor to get together to manipulate the law to create the appearance of a violation. We are not tough on crime. We are tough on our people, but we allow rampant crime to be committed by those who are being paid by us to supposedly protect us.
Oh, Ed, could you just go ahead and state your question and then?
So the question is, how many people have been prosecuted for abusing their positions of public trust as a police officer, as a prosecutor, as a judge, to send innocent people to jail? How many of those people have been prosecuted for their crimes?
Would anyone like to address that? I think partly what you're asking about is sovereign immunity and the ability to hold prosecutors or police accountable when
I don't think any of us would have any clue how the number, we just, there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of cases every year. So if you got a specific case you want to ask about, I think we'd entertain it, but to speculate statewide in a given time frame would be impossible.
Well, I wanted to just bring up the question of truth in sentencing because I think that I imagine many people here are familiar with that, but for a particular offense, you could have a range, like in Texas, a third-degree felony, which includes possessing 1 to 4 grams of drugs. That's 2 to 10 years, which would be prison or probation. Now, in some other states, there's more of a truth in sentencing approach where you have to serve 85%. But if that 85% is of a much smaller amount than 10 years, it could boil down to roughly the same amount of time people serving in prison. But Adam, I'm wondering if you could address kind of what you've seen in terms of public opinion on this question of, is it the total number of years someone serves, or is it the percentage of their sentence that they serve?
Sure. Do you want me to stand up here just so
Sure.
I'm not behind the podium for folks? Thanks for the question. We have done pretty extensive public opinion research on this, and when I say we, I should really say that we partnered with 2 of the most prominent polling firms in the country to do political polling, public opinion strategies, and Bill McInturf on the Republican side, and the Benenson Group and the Mellman Group on the Democratic side, and they got together and actually did the questionnaires and did the research. And what's fascinating is, and maybe not so surprising to veterans of the system, but what's fascinating is that people have a strong preference for a high percent of sentence served than they do for a high amount of time served, right? They'd much rather see somebody serve 85%. And let me just put I don't have the numbers, I don't think necessarily at the tip of my tongue, but one of the ways that devised to ask this question was, would you prefer somebody serve 4 years of a 5-year sentence, or the same offender serve 6 years of a 10-year sentence? Right, that's sort of to try to get at, you're more interested in serving 4 years or 6 years, or serving closer to the sentence that was meted out in court. And the results were somewhere in the, I believe, in the high 70s, if not the 80s, in terms of preference for the shorter amount of time in prison, but that was closer, a higher percent of sentence. So I think that's just a really key piece here. I think I'm trying to remember one of the other ways, Mark, that we got at this was around this issue of max outs. And I think around the country, we did a report this past year on max outs at about a quarter. I think it was 23% or so of inmates around the country are actually serving out their sentences and being released to the street with no supervision at all, which to a lot of people doesn't make common sense, and the research is sort of bearing out that it makes sense to have a period of transitionary supervision afterwards. Texas, I think, if I recall, the max out rate is about 17%, so a decent number, but below the national average. But so as part of this most recent research we did, we asked people, both for violent offenders and nonviolent offenders, and I'll be the first to sort of say people do definitely make a distinction between violent and nonviolent offenders in the way they want them to be treated. But on this question, we asked, would you rather a nonviolent offender serve 3 years of a 3-year sentence and be released, or 2 years followed by 1 year of supervision? And we asked for violent offenders, would you rather them serve 5 years of a 5-year sentence or 4 years of a 5-year sentence followed by a year of supervision? And these were also well past majorities. These are also in the 70 to 80%, preferring the shorter sentence followed by a period of supervision than maxing out. Which is astonishing, particularly for the violent offenders. And I'll just finish up, Mark, by saying quickly, the one thing the pollsters were particularly impressed by is that the strongly support for those shorter sentences followed by supervisions were over, in many cases, over 50% as well, sometimes up into 60 or 70% of people saying they strongly prefer that. And for pollsters, when they see a number of strongly support in the 30s or 40s, they feel like that's a pretty intensely held belief, so these numbers were really quite surprising to them.
Just one observation I wanted to offer on that, though, is I think regardless of what that sentence is, if you have a violent offender, people want to see some period of supervision afterwards during that time frame when they're reintegrating back into the community. So I don't know if the option would necessarily be less sentence with supervision. It would probably be supervision, period. And that is an area that I agree, and we're looking at in Arizona too, about that reentry period of time in order to address some of the criminogenic factors and reduce opportunities for recidivism. You know, we were talking earlier, the two ends of the system, if you will, at the front end, identifying those offenders who are most amenable to diversion, treatment, and services, and keep them from coming back into the system, and then on the back end too, particularly those who are initial commitments to prison when they're getting out, trying to ensure that they don't come back into the system again. That's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think across the country states are starting to look at, and there may be a lot of benefits from that.
Oh, down here.
Within the state or even nationally, you see any programs that are looking at true forgiveness where after a certain time a former felon is forgiven and given all his rights as a full citizen and even possibility of his record being cleared?
Within Arizona, after a period of time, particularly if it's a first felony offense, once you've completed your sentence, whether that's from incarceration or after probation, your rights are automatically restored with the exception of the right to possess and own a firearm. You have to petition for that after a couple of more years. And depending upon the original offense, it's usually granted. If it's 2 felonies or more, it's entirely discretionary with the original judge who handled it. And as far as expungement of a record, there are other states around the country, I think in Illinois is one jurisdiction where they took a look at it, that they are looking at some instances where people have gone a significant period of time. Generally speaking, if someone goes 7 years or more without having any contact with the criminal justice system, you can say they are completely rehabilitated. You'll never see them again. And they're starting to look at some of those with the initial category of offenses dealing with substance abuse, drug possession, drug use.
Yeah, and that's excellent. In Texas, we have both non-disclosure and expunction. And non-disclosure is if you get deferred adjudication probation. One of the challenges with that, well, there's several, but one of them is if it's a felony, you've got to wait 9 years typically because it's 4 years of probation, then 5 years waiting period after that. And as he just said, 7 years. So we'd like to look at reducing some of those waiting periods during this session. Oh, Shannon, sorry, I missed you. We'll get you next. Oh, let's get Shannon now. Yeah, he's all right.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. I've got a question for our two legislators. We've had a lot of data here today from a private group and from our counterpart in Arizona, TDCAs, who had to pay for their own study of who was being sent to prison. And we have a problem here in this state. You mentioned Mr. Fabello earlier, used to be a state employee, and his office got line item vetoed, I think, in 2003, and it hasn't been back since. And there isn't a week that goes by that I don't get a question from a reporter or somebody in the Capitol asking me for data about something. We just don't have it. The LBB tries to do what they can, but it's a much stripped down version. So I wonder if there's been any discussion, now that we're going to have a new governor, who might be more amenable to that idea of reconstituting the old Criminal Justice Policy Council so that we can have good information on which to base our future policy decisions?
I don't know where you've been, but our new governor and his colleagues want less government. So I don't think they're inclined to start a new agency, even if it might prove to be a cost saver. But obviously I haven't heard any. I have trouble, and I'm sure Dan does too. I mean, Dan, getting data. And let me tell you how bad it is. TDCJ doesn't even have the data. You walk the halls of a prison and you ask about a particular inmate, they'll send down their office and they get a 3x5 card. And there's pretty much where he's from, what's the nature of his crime, how many grievances he's filed, da-da-da. So data processing and information is very inadequate in the adult system. So, you know, Fabello is taught me so much starting in '93. He's a state asset, wrongfully removed in 2003 for being candid and straightforward in finance. But that's an interesting piece of history. But to answer your deal, why don't your organization advocate? And why don't your organization, pretty powerful, influential group across the state that everybody wants their support of, why don't you talk about how it would enhance public safety if we knew who we were locking up and what the performance and have some transparency and accountability? That would be a great project for you, and I'll recognize you in my, if I'm calling witnesses. No, I'm really serious, Shannon. I mean, that's how we would get there, is for you and your credibility to advocate that. It'd be probably much more effective than me doing it, because everybody knows I love Fabello.
There are a lot of groups on
And we wouldn't even take Fabello back because he's doing great things nationally.
money.
No, good point. We all need data.
Yeah.
Tony's going to kill us.
Well, I concur with the senator that we're not going to grow government. I just don't see that there's a desire to do that. But I think we can be more intelligent about data, and I agree that we need to look for ways to have maybe a greater number of public-private partnerships in this area to create data. One of the issues that I see is that I'm told they're collecting data in some part of TDCJ, right? But yet it's siloed, right? So it's an issue of connecting all of it to where you have a dashboard view about what's really going on. In other words, numbers that mean something as opposed to those just really in a siloed type of approach. But no question, data is probably the biggest thing. As chairman of that committee, I was frustrated not to have enough of. And I think everybody in this room that studies these issues feels the same way. But I think there are more intelligent ways to get there versus growing government with a new agency. So
And
we need to be intelligent about it.
And I'll be cynical for a moment, which I've earned the right to be. I'm not sure TDCJ wants us to have all their data. Because if I got that, but it's a factor. As long as we don't have a study group, a think tank such as Fabello's, all the information we got is what they furnish us. And that's not healthy. I agree with you. But,
Well,
but it is reality.
Can I just say quickly, notice what this conversation is about. You have the Prosecutors Association saying we want data, and the chairman of the committee saying we want data. This is not a conversation. I don't know, maybe for you it would have happened 10 years ago, but
93.
Certainly not then. And in many states, not until recently would there be committee chairmen and folks and a prosecutor from Arizona coming with data to this discussion and making this conversation about data and asking the questions about it, who actually is behind the walls and everything. I think it's worth just noticing how far this conversation has come from one that was totally based on emotion and ideology to one that is now more and more based on research and data.
The day of the data guy.
Oh, yeah. But I think one of the reasons for that is that, you know, reform or throwing one more law out there just for that sake without determining whether or not it's affecting the public policy objective, it's ridiculous. And so you know, the reason why we did it as prosecutors in Arizona is because we were asking the question. We believe that our policies are oriented towards incarcerating the most violent and the most repetitive offenders that we have within our criminal justice system. Sure. And we looked around the room and said, are we doing it? We didn't know. So, well, let's find out who's in prison. And that's how we can start off by determining whether or not we're doing our job right as government officials. And that's also a cornerstone from the discussion that we've had so far in the slides I went through in fast fashion. Are we then having an impact on the crime rate? And I think we should own it. We should own it instead of just talking about numbers of cases handled, conviction rates, that's all great, but it's fluff if it's not actually improving public safety and improving the lives of our citizens. And then looking at recidivism rates as well, instead of being on that treadmill and just year over year talking about how many more crimes were committed, how many more cases were prosecuted.
And I agree, and in Texas, where we really need help is to distinguish from one community to the other. I mean, the hell with who we already got there. I mean, they're there, and we ought to know who we got locked up, as they do in Arizona. But I'd love to know the sentencing practices in Bexar County versus Harris County, Dallas County, and even in rural area. It is very frustrating and angry that within the same state laws, you'll get a completely different outcome in sentencing in Harris County as you would. There's probably 1,500 misdemeanors confinees in the Harris County Jail this afternoon because they can't afford $1,000 to pay a bond. Haven't gone to court their first setting yet. If they're in Dallas or Travis County, they get a PR bond. They're at work today. And they wonder why the Harris County Jail is overcrowded, because they don't have a pre-release program. I would love the data to drill down, and that's what Tony would have done an excellent job at doing. But someone needs to put some sunlight on the difference in the different type justice and degree of justice you get depending on where you are. If you're some poor African American in East Texas, I will promise you'll get probably a different outcome than you would if you're in Travis County. And we need to have a grown-up discussion about that.
Well, and that does also say something about the categorical thing what they did in Arizona, where you can't go to prison for your first and second low-level drug possession, because that's going to mean someone who now might be getting 10 years, as I said, for that in East Texas prison versus someone in Travis County who's getting a few years of probation for that same offense. So anyway, I think that we've got a lot of great ideas here. We have another question? Okay, back there. I'm sorry. And then we'll
Shannon, you get it.
Oh, you want to go first? I think he was first.
Mine's
Yeah.
real quick.
Okay.
I know the Wyndham School District is taking a lot of hit inside. Are there programs to attach these guys to education when they get out to keep them from coming back?
no.
Are there programs we're looking at that way?
Answer is no.
Is it of interest?
I would say
Of course.
certainly of interest. In fact, I had a conversation with Clint Carpenter maybe 10 days before Christmas about this very topic, and looking at some new things that are out there that we can look at to help these individuals transition back into life, right? So many of these practical life skills that they don't learn necessarily in getting a GED equivalent. That they need to have, and that was a very discussion we had. So clearly we're interested. It's early in the process, but we need to do more in that area.
Sign me up, I'll help.
Thank you.
My question
Real
is
quick,
for,
I was going to say, some of those programs are offered within prison right now within Arizona. And again, I want to make it very clear, with 40,000 versus over 120, 150, very different scale. But some of those programs are offered within our jail and within our prisons prior to it. But those discrete programs that sound real good, and again, we can report numbers of folks who've gotten their GED, but there's much more that's got to go into that.
my question is for Mr. Montgomery. Thank you for coming, and anyone else can chime in. You mentioned, I think, using cognitive behavioral therapy in reentry programs. If it works well in reentry programs, and if you could elaborate on the data of how it works, why not move it back a little bit, or more than a little bit, while the person's still incarcerated for reentry? Because cognitive behavioral therapy is, I'm interested in your thoughts on the effectiveness, but if you can take hardened criminals and use that and have a much higher success rate on reentry, why not start it much, much sooner? That would be the common sense and inexpensive and humane thing to do.
Yeah, and if I'd had 10 more minutes, I would have covered that while I was at the podium. But, but no, that's exactly what I've started advocating for. And I had the benefit of serving on our new governor's transition committee looking at crime and child safety issues. And that's one of the things that we noted. Our DOC has looked at implementing that program for close and maximum security prisoners to deal with them when they've committed a violent offense while they're in that setting. But that's exactly the point, taking a look at in success. In the reentry programs, the two that I was specifically referencing for community partners, they're private, they're private enterprises, and the recidivism rates run 10 to 15%. So they've got 85 and 90% success, and they're using cognitive behavioral therapies as part of that. If anybody's interested, Dr. Stanton Salmon Inside the Criminal Mind, 3rd edition, to where I got all that information from, but it focuses on that. And one of the recommendations is to take that program and use it for everybody when they are admitted into prison and start working it there. But we need to turn our idea of prisons upside down. Because right now when you go into prison, you start off in general population, which is segmented by the nature of your offense and what your reputation is and the color of your skin or the gang you're a member of. Those aren't the kind of values we want people to have to be successful when they leave and reintegrate into society. General population ought to be as close to what someone's going to be living in when they leave prison and reflect the kind of social mores and values that are going to allow them to be successful. And that kind of therapy from the outset, I think, would be very helpful in doing it.
Mark, do I get a second shot?
Sure.
This is for Senator Whitmire and Representative Parker. Given what he just said about the high success rate, do we have any bills coming up in the upcoming session in the state of Texas to fund that and to do that? If the payback is so good, it sounds like a very virtuous thing to do.
No, I didn't hear necessarily, he was given a concept of doing it on the front end, which obviously makes a lot of sense. I didn't hear that it was necessarily been implemented yet. But let me tell you how screwed up we are. You know, I said they get passing grades. That's a relative term. Today, I don't care how long you serve, sex offender, 10, 15, 20 years, DWI, 5 years. Any of those that require and offer rehabilitation, you're giving it the last 6 months of your sentence. So you can be admitted to TDCJ this afternoon for being a sex offender, serving 10 to 15 years. You'll be a general population inmate. They first break you down by sending you to the fields. Then if you behave, you might get an inside job, et cetera, et cetera. Sir, you get one, I don't care how long you're in TDCJ, the average increase in education level is 1 year. You go in with a 6th grade education, you come out as a 7th grader.
And that's the average, yeah.
So I can't worry. I'm concerned about the parolees and their education, but I would rather educate them while we have them. But back to a treatment program. If we had the resources and we had the leadership in TDCJ on their board, starting with their board, why in the world wouldn't we give the inmate rehabilitation, require him or her to go to classes at the front end instead as a condition of parole? First of all, I know for a fact a lot of them fake it till they make it. They say, you got to go through this DWI program your last 6 months, you've been there 4 years. They go, they act like they're instant. It's to get out as a condition of parole. I saw a sex offender treatment program in Huntsville about 6 months ago. Classroom, guys on the way out. Don't you think they would benefit from having started getting the counseling and the cognitive whatever when we first received them? I think it would be a better inmate. They would grow with the program. And I would also, if I was a correction officer, I would think it would make for a better environment. So we got a whole bunch of work to do, particularly as, and historically, we've always had waiting lists for people to get in these classes. I'm told, getting back to data, remember I said we only get what TDCJ tells us? That there's not a waiting list now. You used to get approved for parole, and then you'd go wait as a condition of parole. You got to go through this rehab program, these counseling. You might wait, after you've been approved for parole, you got to go back and wait 9 months, a year or more to get in the class that'll let you actually be paroled. I can't imagine what that does to the morale and the attitude of the inmates, which ultimately affects the correction officer. So we got a lot of things to do. And as Mr. Montgomery pointed out, we got such a massive system. I mean, 40,000 is a lot, but we got 1.5 Waco, Texas locked up. Next time you drive through Waco, which is 100,000 people, we got 1.5 of them that we feed, clothe, guard, provide medicine for at 108 locations. So Representative Parker and I have a full plate. We've made a lot of improvements, but we got a lot to do. And part of the frustration and the complexity is the sheer size. $3 billion a year is why we need to be having this conversation, by the way. We spend $3 billion taxpayer dollars on this system. We can't afford to waste any monies. So
But in summary, let me make one comment. That is, I do think you'll see legislation that will be filed that deals with rehabilitation type issues during the session.
Real quick, too.
More intelligent.
Just out of fairness for state-level legislators in Texas, those two programs, those reentry programs I was referring to, I help fund them out of my asset forfeiture monies at the county level. Our state doesn't provide any dollars.
Good point.
Speaking of that, we had an event on asset forfeiture reform, and Shannon was one of the panelists, as well as Representative David Simpson. But we've got nice little booklets here of summarizing that event. This is first in our kind of archival series. It's quite beautiful, I think. So please pick one of those up. David, you have them outside. David Rayboy is our new communications director. What'd you say? Outside on the table out there. So I think these will be a great series that we're going to do one on the Harris County pretrial justice on mental health summit that Chairman Whitmire spoke at. We're going to have another booklet in case you missed that will come out with the proceedings of that. So anyway, do we have any other questions? We probably are bumping up against the hour. One more up down here.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to know what, in the panelists' opinions, is the public safety component of low-level marijuana users, and why is a criminal record for low-level marijuana users necessary?
Well, historically, the legislature has been reflecting public sentiment. Today, I think it's in kind of changing mood, the public, as they are on other issues. And I think we just have to see, after the new members are sworn in, where we are. But I would suggest, when I got to the legislature in '73, one marijuana, I forget what the hell you call it, joint. I never really knew, but was a felony. People were going to prison, and I can remember Jim Maddox and his legislation in '73. So obviously, social mores change. I think you're witnessing certainly that on low-level amounts of marijuana. We just got to wait and see. Obviously, you know how I feel. You prioritize public safety. Jail cells are an asset. Prison cells are an asset. You shouldn't waste them on people that you're not afraid of. Don't get after the people you're mad at. I think we're in a public discussion about how much of a danger low-level marijuana poses. Certainly, I'll let Representative Parker speak as to the aspect of medical. You know, I've visited California and Colorado, different experiences. Different experiences, that sounds like our experience. Walking down the street, walking down the street in Colorado, we could smell the guys that I were out there with visiting a golf course, smelled marijuana coming out of the cars. It's very prevalent. I had been on a school suspension program in LA a couple of months before. We had some time to kill. We went down on the beach, and they were doing for medical marijuana, trying to hustle us into a clinic if you had an allergy. I asked them, I said, is stress covered? But so to answer your question is, I think, as you well know because you work in the field, we're in transition. Where it's going to end up, I'm not sure. I'll yield to my colleague.
Well, I think obviously what we're seeing today is based, as Senator Whitmire said, on sentiment of the public, broadly speaking, over the course of the last 30, 40 years. No question about that. And I do think things are changing. But a couple thoughts. I mean, one, I don't like the term decriminalization. I'll just tell you up front, I don't like that term. I think what you're trying to do is to basically go forward with a penalty for something that's viewed as being obviously something against the rules of society, but we got to be more intelligent about the various punishments that we put in place. Specifically with regard to medical marijuana, I mean, obviously what's happened in Colorado and California, I think you'll never see that happen here in Texas. So in my opinion, I just don't think you'll ever, I never want to see Texas go that direction. Now, I think there is legitimate discussion within the legislature with regard to medical marijuana for specific medical conditions, where there is specific medical documentation and the body of knowledge, not just in Texas but around the country, shows that medical marijuana would provide specific benefit for a particular illness, perhaps like an intractable case of childhood epilepsy, right? So something that's tightly written and dispensed through a pharmacy system like we do today with any other narcotic, be it OxyContin or Dilaudid or any other type of narcotic that's prescribed today. So those are my thoughts. Again, I think those are discussions that the legislature will probably start to have here in the 84th. But again, I think sentiment broadly is changing on a number of those issues. But again, coming back to my theme earlier, you know, Texas will continue to be tough on crime, but we want to be smart on crime as well. So.
And I wouldn't be surprised in our lifetimes that Washington will address the issue. It's going to be crazy as hell to have it legal in Colorado in fact, my buddies, we'd gone out there for a 3-day vacation. We had to wait for our golf clubs forever in Houston, like 45 minutes to an hour in our luggage. And I speculated, and I think I was very accurate, because we were coming from Colorado. I think their drug dogs were going crazy, checking out all the baggage on that plane. So I don't know how in a rational country, maybe that's not the right answer, but
No.
how are you going to have a drug policy in Colorado and then Washington? I mean, the point is, I think, and I doubt if they're ready to make major reforms in Washington with what I read they did the last couple of days in the speaker's race. But the point is, for the good of the country, I think we probably need a national policy on it, because I don't think on something of that significance you can fly into one state and it's legal as hell. In L.A., when I was waiting and checking my luggage on the curb, some guy was so stoned out of his mind he didn't know what was going on. So I asked the baggage checking guy, I said, how often do you have to deal with something like that? He said, man, I just get them inside. And I don't think that's the best way to run a country. And so I think you'll see a national, since it's very much like on same-sex marriage and other social monumental issues, we need to come together as a nation. It's either good or bad. And then probably this organization would argue it's a states' rights issue. So I'm probably fixing to not get invited back, but which is okay.
No, so it is a Schedule I drug, which is the most dangerous drug under federal law. So I mean, there's definitely room for changes there to give states more flexibility. Anyway, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful. Thank you, Senator Taylor. Thank you, Judge Francis, the great drug court judge here in Texas. So.